this amazing event, the declaration of the State of Israel on the 14th of May, 1948. Of course, when that happened, our hearts were full of joy because we saw the Bible predictions coming true. Passages like this one, where God said he would take the people of Israel from the nations and bring them to their own land. And we share in that wonderful hope, the hope of Israel in that land of hope and glory. And there's no doubt about it, whenever way we look at it, we are informed by the scriptures that Israel is the most glorious of all lands in the sight of God. And it's only a small country, very, very tiny as far as land area goes on the face of this earth. It's only 1/6% of the landmass of the Middle East, let alone that of the whole world itself. And yet here is that land which is so crucially important and so vital in the purpose of God. And it's a land which has given us miracles as we've seen the people of Israel, God's people, there for 70 years. The hope of Israel. Yes, that's the hope that we share. When we look back in the past and we see the time that the land was promised to Abram and his descendants, it's amazing the exact area that was involved. This white area on the land here corresponds to the area, roughly, which was promised to Abram and his descendants. And there's an amazing correspondence, not between that and the land of Israel today, but between that and what's known as the Levant, which is a greater portion of the Middle East, and it's almost identical to that area which was promised to Abram in those promises of so long ago. So let's focus in and see what's been happening in those 70 years. Read the Bible. The land of Israel belongs to the Jews, say these Jews. And yes, they are correct. We know they are, because that's what the scriptures say. They make it unmistakably clear that God was going to give them the land of Israel. And as you look at what was promised to Israel in the days of the early days of this country, in the time of the 1920s, there was a mandate made as a home for the Jews. And when you look at a map of the Middle East, the Palestine mandate included not just what we know today as the nation of Israel, but included vast swathes of the Middle East, including Jordan and other places like that. That was what was the area that was promised to the Jews as a homeland. But in 1922, Winston Churchill decided he'd alter it slightly, and in fact he gave 80% of that to the Arabs. And by 1948, when Israel was established as a nation, the United Nations decided to get out their carving knives too. And they split that area that was left into two parts, one for the Arabs and one for the Jews. So out of the land that was promised as a homeland for the Jews, only 10% of it was left by 1948 for them. But as we share in the hope, their hope, the rebirth of Israel, we see just how vital God's promises were and how God has been working out his plan. Down the ages, yes, but remarkably in our time, we've witnessed miracle after miracle. Here's a poster. They kept telling us, Jews, go home. So they did. They went to their own land, the land of Israel. On the 14th of May, 1948, came this Declaration of Independence, this famous document. And here's an excerpt from that Declaration of Independence. This is what it says. It says, the Jews in every successive generation strove to re-establish themselves in their ancient homeland. In recent decades, they returned in their masses. They made the deserts bloom. They revived the Hebrew language. They built villages and towns. They created a thriving community, and they brought the blessings of progress to the country's inhabitants. That's what they said. That's what the Jews said. But that's not what happened, is it? This is what really happened. The lines show you where they came from as God was fulfilling his promises. Because God said, I will take you from the nations. I will gather you from all the countries. I will bring you into your own land. And sure enough, God did. So even though they said, as they always have done in their own arrogant way, claiming victory for themselves, we know it's a different story. We know God brought them back to that land. And even though they'd been offered other lands, none of them would do, because quite clearly it was laid out in God's plan and God's purpose that he will give them the land of Israel. Even though they'd been offered countries like Cyprus and Kenya and Syria and Madagascar and Vietnam, oh no, none of those would do. It had to be Israel, the land they'd had all those centuries ago, 19 centuries before. It was theirs, and it had to be that land again. This is the people that the world has thrown everything at. This is the people, the race that has been persecuted and despised and hated for 19 centuries. They came back to that land, that historic land of hope. And then amazing things happened on the day that the state of Israel was reborn. They decided that they would defend the country. They had to, because the people around, mainly Arab nations, were none too impressed. In fact, they took a very dim view of this situation. And so, on the very day that Israel was created as a state, along came Syria, Jordan, Egypt, Lebanon, and Iraq, and started to attack from all sides. It was an amazing victory for the people of Israel. 1% of Jews died in the war, sadly. But Israel survived. And they said once again, we've done it. It's our cunning, it's our ability, it's our knowledge which has enabled us to survive. But in reality, of course, we do know differently. God must have been behind this. What we're seeing are miracles in our day. Just think of it. Here's a race of people. They're the only race of people in the entire world that have been evicted and expelled from their land, not just once, but twice, and have returned to that very same land, even after 1900 years. So as we recap the events of this 70 years, let's go to 1967. Now, even though some of us may not recall the SixDay War, then I certainly recall it, and it was, what a year that was. I had actually been baptized in April of that year. So when June came along and this war took place in the Middle East, it was a time of great excitement. But the cartoons were there, the feelings were there, the voices were heard of those surrounding nations. Here's one of President Nasser kicking Israel into the sea. Those were the intentions in those days. And they've said the same thing again and again and again as they want to push Israel into the sea. They made it quite clear nobody welcomed the Jews. Just as for 19 centuries nobody had welcomed the Jews. Another cartoon featured Jewish skulls piled high in Tel Aviv. These were the motives of the nations around Israel. So in June 1967, the world stood in amazement as the countries around Israel attacked from the north and the east and the south. From a human point of view, that was the end of the story. No more Israel. She was outnumbered. So many enemies against her. How could she possibly survive? And along came this iconic figure, Moshe Dayan. general of the Israeli army. And he presented himself as the new defense minister of Israel on 3rd of June 1967. But you remember what happened. I'm sure many of you in this room must have been around in 1967 when the Israeli army occupied the old city of Jerusalem. They gained access to the Wailing Wall. They captured that area which had remained out of their grasp even after those days when they come back and established themselves as a state. Or rather, God had established themselves as a state. And what I remember has been amazing is that the comments around the world, the news bulletins, that they couldn't understand how it could possibly be that a nation so small as this could survive such an attack. And I always remember the cartoons which appeared in the newspapers. And there were two of them of note. Both of them depicted the Red Sea opening. And the President Nasser's here in the foreground with his army, waiting to attack Israel. But the Red Sea's opened, and somebody says to him, "It's too risky, President Nasser. Maybe the Israelis are being supported by a force even more powerful than the Americans." Now, these cartoonists somehow had put into their expressions in this cartoon the reality of what was happening. They made fun of it, yes. They thought, this is strange, this is odd. But little did they realize that what they were depicting was actually the reality of what took place. I think that one was the Daily Express, and this one on a similar theme was the Daily Mail. I can't help that nagging feeling. I think it's a trap as the Red Sea opened and invited them to come through. So in 1967, when Israel said, "We did it, we managed to survive, we managed to conquer our enemies," what really happened was the Lord caused their enemies who rose against them to be defeated before them. That's what happened, and we saw it. God at work in this day and this age. And then when we came to 1973, it was a little different. The Yom Kippur War. It almost seemed as if Israel were caught napping. Here was the time of one of their great feasts, October 1973. And the forces from the north and the forces from the south decided they would try and attack. 6th of October. There were the Syrians in the north, there were the Egyptians in the south. And for some amazing reason, they had a golden opportunity, and they missed it. Their opportunity was there. Israel was having a feast. They were all not protecting their coastline or their borders, and they could have walked in and conquered the land if they'd moved in on that day. But apparently, the Syrian tank commander was waiting for a signal from the Egyptian tank commander. And the Egyptian tank commander was waiting for a signal from the Syrian tank commander. And so they waited for a whole day, and they missed their opportunity. Next day, it was just too late. But you see the reality of this when you look at what God said would happen. God said in Exodus 34, verse 24, he said, "No one shall covet your land when you go up to appear before the Lord your God 3 times in the year." So God had said, don't worry, it's okay on a feast day. You can go up to Jerusalem, you can take part in the feasts, and no one will come and invade your land. I will protect you. And that's exactly what happened. Even in 1973, God would not allow anyone to invade their land at a time of prayer. Now, the list could go on. We looked at the famous ones, the ones which moved our hearts and gave us great excitement. We can put the list together. There were others as well. 1948, 1956, 1967, 1973. And then we got 1982, the Lebanon War. 2006, the Second Lebanon War. And they've all taken place and they've all been victorious for the people of Israel. And each time we've looked in amazement and thought, is Jesus coming soon? Whichever way we look at it, it's unmistakable. God is working out his plan. He's still working on that plan. And even today, Israel is in that situation where she's surrounded by aggressive people. There's ISIS, there's the Palestinians, there's Hamas. There's all these people who are wanting rid of Israel. And there's Iran not far away, probably with nuclear capabilities. So what do we say will happen next? It doesn't look pleasant for Israel from a human point of view, but we'll have to wait and see. So that's how Israel has managed to survive, not by her own strength, even though that's where she puts her trust, but Israel has survived because God has said it would be so. Let's come back and say, all right, so what's Israel like as a country, as a nation? What are the Jews doing in that land? What is their success rate and their impact on the world itself? Well, do you know that with regard to population, Israel has the highest ratio of college degrees? So the people there are very intelligent. They also have their own museums more than any other country in ratio to their population. They have numerous startup companies. Motorola, for example, developed the cell phone in Israel. Yes, we've all got one of these, I suppose, most of us. And yes, it was a Jew who invented that. Voicemail technology, that was invented and developed in Israel. The first antivirus software for computers was created in Israel in 1979. And I remember it had the name of Dr. Solomon, a biblical name. Israel published more books, translated from other languages, than any other nation in the world. Wherever you look, Israel is trying to make an impact on the rest of the world by what she does. And as far as high technology goes, there are more than 3,000 high technology companies. So that means Israel has the highest concentration of high-tech companies in the world outside Silicon Valley. So if I show you a picture of what's been developed by these countries, you perhaps get some idea. Now, I suppose those with computers, you must have used one of these memory sticks. That was a Jewish invention. The pill cam, which you can swallow and it takes pictures of your inside for medical purposes, that is a Jewish invention. Microsoft has more employees in Israel than it does per capita anywhere else in the world. Microsoft, of all companies. We can think of the inventions that Israel has achieved, the discoveries she's made. You see, every scrap of food is important. Every drop of water is vital in the land of Israel. So what about drinking water? What about tomatoes? Well, here's two success stories for the people of Israel. 10 years ago, an Israeli company developed the technology to produce drinking water from thin air. A condenser condenses the air and takes the moisture out of it and condenses it into water, drinking water. And what about tomatoes? We all like tomatoes with our salads, I suppose. Well, genetically modified regular tomatoes, which ripen slowly and stay fresh in transportation, are a Jewish invention. They're developed in a particular way so they stay fresh longer. Wherever you look, the Jews have made amazing discoveries which have affected us all throughout the world. Many of those discoveries in the 70 years since Israel was born. Insulin, medical discoveries, cures for various diseases like typhus and diabetes and tuberculosis and polio. All of those we depend on today, and we thank the Lord for them because his people, his witnesses, the Jews, have produced them. Have you heard about the super cows in Israel? Israeli cows, produce far more milk than other countries. They produce about up to 10.5 tons a year, which is a good 10% more than the North American cows produce, and it's 50% more than Germany's cows produce. Interesting fact for you. I thought you'd appreciate that. Israel also is in the space race. She's one of the few countries in the world that can launch its own satellites into space. And Israel has the highest average living standards in the Middle East, far exceeding that of this country. So the living standards are high, the inventions are there, the technology is there. Everything is there for Israel, it seems, or so they tell us. It's a land which has suffered extremes. Do you know it can snow in Israel? And in particular, 1992, there was such severe snow that several centimeters fell in the desert, the Negev. It can also be very hot there. Benjamin Netanyahu's office spent more than £1,700 on ice cream in 2012. And Israel's tried to fit in with the rest of society. So she's entered competitions like the Miss World competition. She won the Eurovision Song Contest. So there's been a winner of Miss World that's been Jewish. They've won the Eurovision Song Contest. And they've done all sorts of developments which have benefited the world there in Israel in the last 70 years. An Israeli company has even developed the world's first jellyfish repellent. And if you want a cure for bad breath, well, again, it's been developed in Israel. An easy way to fix it. If you want to remove unwanted hair, well, the Epilady is a fantastic device, apparently, though I've not used it myself. Israel is the only country to revive an unspoken language, a language that's been dormant for many years, and establish it as its national tongue. And of course, there's passages like Zephaniah 3, where we say this is a picture of the kingdom, yes, but is there an indication here of what's happened in terms of language in Israel, where God says he would change the speech of the peoples to a pure speech, that all of them may call upon the name of the Lord and serve him with one accord? But that's the trouble, isn't it? The people of Israel are full of themselves. They're not full of the Lord. In general, they are far away from the things of God. They try to conform to the rest of the world in their own way. So any guesses what this shop is? Can you read the Hebrew in the middle? Well, if you can't, it doesn't matter. The M's give it away, don't they? It's McDonalds. There's more than 40 of them in Israel. But they're not normal McDonalds. They're kosher McDonalds. You see, even though they try and fit in with the rest of the world, they still have their own little rules and little regulations, mainly from the Old Testament, which make them different. And no matter how hard they try, they will always be different. They will always be special. They will always be peculiar in all senses of that word. Even the glue on Israeli stamps is kosher. You've got to lick it, haven't you, to put it and stick, make it stick. And here's a good one. Make it cheaper. Now, this is only something the Jews could do. People who keep Shabbat, the Sabbath, can buy car insurance, which doesn't cover a Sabbath. So you're only paying for 6 days out of the week. Just think of that. You can save 1/7 of your premium. So here's the poster. Experience a miracle in the Holy Land. I think you can just about make it out on the bottom there, but it's those words that actually have more than one meaning, don't they? Because even though we're looking at the peculiarities of the Jews, we are experiencing a miracle in the Holy Land. And another one where the Old Testament comes into play on the buses. There's an inscription there telling people to give their seats up to someone who is aged and in need of a seat, quoting the passage from Leviticus as a motivation to do that. So there you have the culture of Israel, the things they do day to day, these 70 years on. But Israel also absorbs immigrants. They come in search of democracy, religious freedom, and opportunity, and the ability to do something. So it's not just the Jews there in Israel. The Jews are encouraging others to come and share their experience. But when you look at the physical land and how things have changed in 70 years, we can look at passages like this which tell us that the land was going to be transformed. And this may be a picture of the kingdom. I believe it is. It will be truly remarkable when Jesus is back. What we're seeing today is only a glimpse of what it will be like in the future. But the Israeli engineers and agriculturists and all these people, they've developed irrigation techniques. They've done all sorts of things to improve the way plants and crops can grow. The Sea of Galilee at the north of Israel, did you know that that's 200 meters or more below the level of the sea? That's a startling fact, isn't it? Even the Sea of Galilee is below sea level. And the Dead Sea, well, that's remarkably low. It's the lowest place on earth. And the surface of the Dead Sea is about 400 meters or more below the level of the sea. It's always a famous quiz question, isn't it? What's the lowest place in the earth? And the contestants haven't a clue. They scratch their heads and think, what can it be? But the answer is the Dead Sea. There's nowhere like it. The Dead Sea has so much concentration of salt that sinking is impossible in the water. But what's happened to the change of this area? You see, in 1973, you can probably just make out there was a huge, reasonably large area of the bottom part of the Dead Sea. By 1987, much of that had disappeared, and by 2000, it's virtually all gone. And nowadays, it's just left with this situation where the water's all gone. And because of the salt and what's been happening there, then it's left the awful possibility of sinkholes emerging. And they do. You can suddenly find yourself in the bottom of a sinkhole that's caved in under you. So people are not allowed to walk in much of that area now. So behind all this, you see God is at work. And the world itself has the way in which it regards this strange, unique people. We have a word in our dictionary which is unique to the Jews: Antisemitism, the strong dislike or cruel and unfair treatment of Jewish people. The ghetto is an area of a city where Jews are made to live. A pogrom is an organized massacre, usually against the Jews. The Holocaust, the killing of millions of Jews by the Nazis in the Second World War. This is how the world thinks of the Jews, with words like this in the dictionary, which focus on one race of people only. Today we have anti-Semitism yet again, and you don't need me to tell you about the Labour Party and the anti-Semitism there, where people just do not like the Jews because they succeed. It's as simple as that. Their success rate is high. Israel is a land of conflict, but God does have a solution, and Jesus is going to bring peace to the Middle East. Another comparison for 70 years in terms of maps: disappearing Palestine this time. There on the left is the green area, is the land of Palestine in 1946. When the United Nations produced their plan, the white area in the next picture became a land for Israel, the Jews. The green area was the Palestinians. But what actually happened was a bit different, because between 1949 and 1967, then really the Jews took most of it, and the Palestinians were left with the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. But look at the one on the right. By 2012, little spots of green left in the West Bank. The Jews have been taking the territory ever since. And ever since they've taken Jerusalem, there's been a dispute. They've had walls made, walls to keep people out, to keep the Palestinians away, to keep the bombers out. This is a land not just of hope and glory, but it's a land of difficulty, a land of war, a land where people are on edge. So the walls in 2012 were lots of them, 273 miles have been completed, 35 miles under construction, and there was another 131 miles planned. But in September 2014, the Israeli government voted not to reauthorize the barrier in a particular area. So, walls, yes, and Jerusalem, the Israeli capital. And the reason why we see a man like Donald Trump as President of America, because he's made Jerusalem, as far as he's concerned, the capital city of the nation of Israel. And he's got people's backs up. You see, Jerusalem is a much fought-after place. And in all their long history, they've been attacked all these amazing times. So whichever way we look at it, Israel is a nation which has now survived 70 years. We look with hope to the future, to that day of Christ's return, where the Lord Jesus on the Mount of Olives is a particular focus for him. This is the time we can look forward to, when the Lord shall go forth from Zion, and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. So we all say, yes, 70 years, we thank the Lord for it. Let's hope this year, next year, we may be in Jerusalem. Thank you.